Welcome back, Spare Parts Army. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. You often hear the phrase, America spends more on their military than the next 9 countries combined. So I want to explain why this issue is a lot more complicated and actually worse than you might think, but in ways you might not expect. Let's talk about some raw numbers first. The American Department of Defense received a fiscal year 2023 budget of $797 billion. Looking at how the money is actually used, the US federal government provides a detailed list of what dollars are being spent and where. It might come as a surprise to some, but $120.5 billion, or a quarter of the US military's entire defense budget, actually goes towards payments to retired personnel, housing costs, employment assistance, and other benefits a service member might qualify for once their time in the military is up. $50 billion in the Pentagon goes to healthcare costs. In fact, according to 2021 Stockholm International Peace Research Institute data, if you were to rank total dollar amounts in total veteran benefits, the United States comes in first place with over $250 billion spent, spending over 4 times what second place China spends at $59 billion, and spends more than China, Russia, India combined in taking care of its veteran population through the Department of Veteran Affairs. However, at the same time, the US military defense budget consumes approximately half of all discretionary federal spending, and the country would benefit from many of the wasteful defense programs being cut and corruption in the Department of Defense being stamped out. So why are we spending so much more if other countries seem to have no problem spending so much less on more troops? To answer this, we'll need to look at a couple of things. The percent of GDP America spends on national security and where the money is actually going. But first, on to today's sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. In 2020, there were over 5 million car crashes. That's more than 15,000 a day and 600 an hour. And did you know that you're not suing the person who hit you, rather their insurance company? Those in an accident can be entitled to more than you think. Injured and don't know where to start? With Morgan & Morgan, it's so easy. With Morgan & Morgan, you can submit a claim without ever having to leave your couch. In 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim to Morgan & Morgan. If you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. For more information, go to forthepeople.com or dial #law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. Right now, the United States spends about 3.5% of gross domestic product on national defense, which places them at number 15 compared to the rest of the world. Gross domestic product is a standard measure of the value created through the production of goods and services in a country over the year. One of the reasons military spending and federal spending in general is compared to the GDP is to give a reference point for the size of the federal government's spending compared with economic activity throughout the entire country. So it gives us a rough idea of how much taxes and revenue a country is going to collect and how much they have at stake to protect. So you notice you probably wouldn't want to live in a country that spends 50% of their GDP on defense like North Korea, and you might not want to live in a country that only spends 0.5% on defense. The hard part is figuring out what the correct middle ground should be. For context, during World War II, defense spending was 41%. In the Korean War, it was 14%. During the height of the Cold War, it fell to 10%. Vietnam, it was 4.9%. And during the global wars on terror, defense spending was 4.6%, and we're now down to about 3.5%. This makes the United States by far the largest gross spender on defense, but only third in terms of military size, with India and China both having larger standing armies. Currently, the American military has about 2.1 million members in uniform, about 1.3 million of those being active duty service members, and the remaining 800,000 serving in the reserves or National Guard. Now, if you want to say that a lot of the US military's defense budget is bloated and wasteful and lousy with corruption, I agree. In 2011, the Commission of Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan concluded that $31 to $60 billion spent in Iraq and Afghanistan had been lost to fraud and waste. Absolutely, the Department of Defense should have to pass an independent audit and eliminate waste. But it isn't until you get to the 4th on the list of top spenders do you actually get into the real military costs that we see in the news headlines. Broken down by branch for this year, the Army will receive $177.5 billion, $194 billion to the Air and Space Force, and $230.8 billion for the Navy and Marine Corps. Here we can see how the individual numbers start to explain why we have such a high budget. As it stands, the Navy is the most expensive branch. And it's no surprise considering the United States owns 11 of the world's 47 operational aircraft carriers, and those 11 are larger and more advanced and more capable than any of the other 36 currently in use by other nations. The Navy also owns 68 nuclear-powered submarines, compared to China's 12 and Russia's 29. Now, what have these aircraft carriers and naval ships been doing since 1945 that's so expensive but justifies that? They've been patrolling the global maritime shipping routes through which, according to the United Nations, around 80% of the global trade by volume and 70% of global trade by value are carried by sea and are handled by ports worldwide. The safety and security of that cargo is often guaranteed by this expensive US naval fleet. If you believe this theory to be true, then geopolitical expert Peter Zion put it best.
We used our Navy, the only one to survive the war, to patrol the global oceans so that anyone could go out anywhere and purchase any raw commodity, bring it home, process it into a finished good, and then re-export it for hard currency. There was just one catch. You had to be on our side versus the Soviets. We bribed up an alliance.
As it is now, even with the US Navy out there patrolling, the global maritime piracy and theft costs the world's economy an estimated $9 billion annually. This operational cost also covers naval air forces, which is the second largest air force in the entire world, second only to the actual United States Air Force, and also funds the entirety of the Marine Corps. It's currently estimated that the yearly cost of deploying an aircraft carrier on a typical deployment is upwards of $46 million a year. And the United States typically has 4 consecutive deployments of aircraft carriers at any given time all across the globe. American aircraft carriers are the go-to way of showing the US political will without having to pull any triggers. Able to carry troops, vehicles, electronic warfare capabilities, air defense assets, and more importantly, aircraft to any coast on Earth. They're a tool of posturing, showing the United States is present and able to fight in any given area. It's also not just military efforts that can be utilized, but also there are massive humanitarian assets, acting as a floating hospital, supply points for humanitarian missions, and logistical movers for aid. In fact, there is an entire section of the Department of Defense called the Overseas Humanitarian Disaster and Civic Aid Fund, whose entire role it is to coordinate civic aid to areas experiencing disasters and emergencies. They make use of the Navy's logistical sea capabilities, as well as the Air Force's massive fleet of 677 cargo planes like the C-17 and C-5, capable of quickly deploying tens of thousands of pounds of civilian material and medical support anywhere with a big enough strip. And it's interesting to note that while the United States spend more than the next 10 nations combined in defense, they're also responsible for the highest amount spent when it comes to foreign aid of any country. $38 billion, or $13 billion in humanitarian aid, which is more than the next 11 countries combined. The infrastructure and logistics for this aid is provided by the Department of Defense. But I'm not here arguing that the US defense budget isn't filled with pork barrel waste programs. It is. The US Department of Defense is the only federal agency unable to pass an independent audit 30 years after Congress required it to do so. Not only is the American military spending the most in terms of the latest equipment and technology, but on average has the 3rd highest pay across all countries. And this pay is still far too low because in 2019, we found that 22,000 active duty service members in America had to go on food stamp benefits in order to pay for groceries. Food stamps is a government-assisted payment, and the US Army is actually currently recommending soldiers apply for food stamps to pay for the cost of rising inflation. This is why, in my opinion, the defense budget problem is so bad, because with a budget like $790 billion, we shouldn't have soldiers having trouble feeding their families. But this is a problem sidestepped by some adversarial nations' conscription policies. Conscripts are often paid infamously low wages and receive little or no benefits after their contract is up. There are over 90 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured with no health insurance, and 600,000 who are homeless. We should be able to solve social problems while maintaining national defense. Looking at the Air Force, it's expected to spend $21.9 billion on operations, large proportion of that going towards towards the training and upkeep of the largest, most advanced Air Force in the world. It currently costs the Air Force roughly $10.7 million to train a qualified F-35 pilot and nearly $11 million for an F-22 pilot. While those figures might seem mind-boggling, average flight hours for an American fighter pilot sits at around 200 hours per year, compared to Russians with 60 to 100 per year and 100 to 110 hours for Chinese pilots. What this means is American pilots are training twice as much as their near-peer counterparts. And that is almost entirely due to more funds dedicated to fuel and maintenance. Less money for training leads to less effective pilots, and less effective pilots lead to battlefield losses for everyone. A large portion of this budget also goes towards missile defense, reducing the threat of ballistic missile strikes, including nuclear weapons, particularly important as the number of possible hostile nations is currently growing. The Army, likewise, has similar advantages due to a larger budget, with it being the worldwide driving force on ground fighting technology research, such as advanced thermal optics, body armor, training facilities, small arms, and logistics capabilities, none of which are cheap. It costs a single armored brigade combat team about $67,000 to move a single mile in terms of fuel and overall maintenance costs. On average, it takes the Army $50,000 to take a single person from civilian to fully trained infantryman, and spends roughly $17,000 equipping that infantryman with gear, rifle, night vision, and ammunition. Compare this to China spending only about $1,500 per infantry soldier, $700 of it going towards the rifle alone. Just like with pilots, less money for training and equipment means less effective soldiers, and less effective soldiers lead to less soldiers getting home. Second on the list is the Department of Defense Working Capital Fund, with its $52.5 billion allocated, taking up over 10% of all defense expenditures. This is essentially the DoD's yearly operating costs of its bases, infrastructure, vehicle maintenance, construction, renovation, hospitals, buildings, logistics, transportation, and some R&D funding. This covers everything from providing flu shots every year to fixing potholes on post. The US also spends a fortune on research and development of new technologies, having spent $124 billion in 2022 in that realm. And oftentimes this research has led to advances in healthcare and telecommunications in the private sector. People often reap the rewards of defense spending in safer air travel and better electronics products. This drive to continuously upgrade our military's capabilities largely comes from the idea of overmatch. The idea of overmatch boils down to each component of a formation having an objective and overwhelming advantage on the battlefield. A perfect example of this was during Desert Storm, where US tanks, through technology alone, outranged, outgunned, outarmored, and outmaneuvered the entire Iraqi army. It follows the old adage, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, and is a major reason that the casualties on the ground in fights were so low. In the year 2023, that takes the shape of every soldier at every level having night vision, while Russian and Chinese soldiers might only have them as their key leaders, squad leaders, or platoon leaders, or even how our human resources troops who are away from the front lines are equipped with modern ballistic body armor, while Russia has struggled to even give their frontline soldiers body armor, much of that being defective or just outright fake. And China having only decided that protecting soldiers with plates was a good idea within the last couple of years. Overmatch is the name of the game of American defense R&D. Americans are uniquely sensitive to battlefield losses, evident in the fact that the death of a single soldier makes national headlines and brings heavy criticism to the government. The DoD, despite its criticisms, places incredibly high value on each soldier and their survivability, and uses overmatch as a way to force protect. The US is by nature an expeditionary force. We historically do not fight on our own turf and counter threats that take soldiers across the globe. Currently, America owns 750 military installations across the globe, spread out across 80 different nations, ranging from full-size scale bases to smaller shared outposts. The benefit the US and host nations gain are often overlooked. Firstly, these bases are typically favored or even outright requested by whatever host nation holds them, like in the Philippines. They not only provide additional military security in the region, but also are a way of enhancing the host nation's own military through training. And most of these installations are paid for for in part by the foreign government itself. Looking at it from a practical, political, and economic sense, it makes more sense to have established bases overseas with a continuous presence of American troops rather than occasional rotations to train with foreign nations. In Germany alone, it's estimated that it would cost taxpayers $130 million more per year to have a smaller rotational basis of American units. Now, the argument can be made to say that we simply should not have troops deployed overseas at all if we aren't at war, and to let everyone else fend for themselves. But this goes against two strategic issues the United States currently faces: deterrence and great power competition. Despite the benefits of deterrence, it's hard to quantify and therefore difficult to show the general population how powerful a peacekeeping tool it is. Great power competition, a very specific term, the key word being competition. Since the end of the arms race of the Cold War, the rise of China as a superpower, we've been in an era of competition. In the geopolitical context, this refers to the three superpowers seeking to gain greater economic, political, and military cooperation in regions that currently do not hold strong ties to any particular nation. For China, this comes in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, where China seeks to essentially strong-arm an economic connection by putting developing countries into debt via infrastructure projects. The United States takes a more military and political approach. A larger focus is to be primary defense partner with these countries. If a civil war breaks out in Chad, we want to be the ones they call for help. Those who are more cynical might view this as some kind of a popularity arms race with guns and range time. Now, of course, the DoD budget is not without its drawback, and it would be dishonest if I were to say that it's a perfect system with no problems whatsoever. There's a natural argument that the United States should be spending less on tanks and rifles and more on education and healthcare. And by no means am I saying that's not a legitimate and valid argument. That said, the DoD budget isn't just tanks and bullets. It's $1.5 billion a year on medical research and $58 billion on healthcare. It's hundreds of thousands for humanitarian and poverty-stricken countries, and disaster relief for Americans, services we can only provide by having a large expeditionary force at the ready. Finally, it's things people don't think about, like $2 billion a year for the Air Force to keep the GPS satellites running, a technology provided for free to anyone that has totally changed the world. We take for granted things like affordable gas, accessible personal technology, and physical security, but would be hard-pressed to have these things if other nations like Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, and the majority of European world were in a constant state of threat or conflict. We tend to laugh at the idea of piracies in the 21st century attacking international shipments on sea, but only because those shipping ports are protected by an alliance of different navies. It can be hard to justify to some why having such a large military is important, when relatively speaking we live in one of the most peaceful eras of history. But that peace is secured in large part by the American military working in cooperation with their allies. We're investing more into the content creation for you, and one of the ways we're able to do this is by you guys joining the members only section of the YouTube channel. I've put a link in the description. I offer exclusive monthly videos that are probably too spicy to post it to the public. There are unique emojis, access to our scripts, and I'm really surprised how many of you have joined so far. We also have a new Fubar and Grill t-shirt available that also helps support the content if you're interested. You guys are the first 1 million subscribers in the Spare Parts Army, and I look forward to bringing you even better rundowns in the future with your support.